Some knowledge is too dangerous, some truths too terrible, and some archives terrify even the masters of the Imperium. I saw the vault door open once. Just once. That was enough. The sound it made was not metal grinding against metal, but something wet and organic, like a throat clearing itself after centuries of silence. I was young then, barely 2 decades into my service as an archival scribe, still naive enough to believe that words on parchment could not kill. The senior archivist who stood beside me that day, a man named Corrigan, who had served in the depths for 40 years, grabbed my wrist hard enough to bruise bone. His lips moved, but no sound emerged, just the shape of a single word. Run. I did not run. The Emperor forgive me. I stayed and watched, and what I witnessed in the moments before that door sealed itself again, carved something permanent into my mind that bleeds whenever I close my eyes. They recruited me from a Schola Progenium on the hive world of Veritas Prime, selected me because my memory was flawless and my capacity for silence absolute. The Administratum values discretion above all else in those who serve within Terra's deepest levels. I arrived at the Imperial Palace on a transport that descended through acid rain and smog so thick it turned day into perpetual twilight. The palace itself rose above the pollution, like a golden mountain, its spires piercing the clouds, its walls etched with the deeds of heroes whose names alone could fill libraries. I felt pride then, swelling in my chest like a physical thing. To serve here, in the heart of the Imperium, was an honor beyond measure. They led me down within hours of my arrival, down through corridors of marble and gold, then through passages of bare rock where the temperature dropped and moisture beaded on ancient stone, then deeper still into sections where the architecture predated imperial construction, where walls bore markings in languages that had died before humanity learned to speak. The air changed as we descended. It grew heavy, pressing against my lungs with each breath, carrying scents that had no business existing, copper and rot and something sweet that made my stomach turn. My quarters were a cell carved into bedrock, furnished with a cot, a writing desk, and a single lumen strip that flickered with irregular rhythm. The senior scribe who delivered me there was a hunched woman named Vestra, whose eyes had gone completely white from decades of reading by insufficient light. She spoke in a whisper, though we were alone in passages so deep that sound seemed to die before it could travel. "You will catalog what you are given," she said, her breath smelling of recaf and something medicinal. "You will not question what you read. You will not discuss what you read. You will not dream about what you read, if you can help it." She paused at the threshold of my cell, her blind eyes somehow finding mine in the gloom. "And if you are ever ordered to enter the restricted vaults, child, you will pray that your death is swift." I did not understand her warning then. How could I? The archives I worked in during those first months seemed mundane, even tedious. Endless rows of shelving units stretching into darkness beyond the reach of lumens, each shelf packed with data slates and parchment scrolls and leather-bound codices that crumbled at the slightest touch. My task was simple: receive items from the intake conveyors, verify their catalog numbers against manifest lists, transport them to their designated locations within the labyrinth of storage chambers. The work was monotonous, the silence oppressive, broken only by the scratch of my stylus against parchment and the distant hum of ventilation systems struggling against air that seemed to resist circulation. Sometimes I would pass other scribes in the corridors, pale figures in gray robes who moved like ghosts and never met my eyes. Sometimes I would hear sounds from deeper in the archives, echoes that might have been falling objects or might have been something else entirely. I learned not to investigate. The restricted sections began 3 levels below my assigned zone. I knew this because the architecture changed at that threshold, shifting from imperial construction to something older and stranger. The walls there were not carved, but melted, their surfaces rippling like frozen water. And the doors were not doors in any conventional sense, but circular apertures sealed with mechanisms that seemed to grow from the stone itself. Warning sigils covered every surface, rendered in High Gothic and languages I did not recognize, their meanings unmistakable even without translation. Do not enter. Do not touch. Do not speak of what lies beyond. Armed custodians stood watch at the main access point, silent giants in golden armor, whose eyes tracked every movement with predatory intensity. I never saw them blink. I never saw them shift position. They simply existed, eternal and immovable, barriers of flesh and metal between the curious and the damned. Corrigan was the first person in the deep archives who spoke to me as though I were human rather than another piece of equipment. He found me 6 months into my service, struggling with a manifest discrepancy that threatened to cascade into weeks of recataloguing work. He was tall for someone who spent his life hunched over documents, his back still straight despite decades in the depths. His hair gone completely white, though his face suggested he was not yet old. His hands shook constantly, a fine tremor that never ceased. But his eyes were sharp and clear. "The Emperor protects," he said, the ritual greeting sounding strange in his voice, as though he spoke it out of habit rather than faith. I returned the phrase, and he smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You are new enough to still believe that, I see. Good. Hold on to it as long as you can." He began teaching me the true nature of our work during the raw meal periods, when we would gather in the communal chamber and eat ration bars that tasted of protein paste and despair. The archives, he explained, were not simply storage facilities, but quarantine zones for information too dangerous to destroy. The Imperium had learned through bitter experience that some knowledge could not be erased. Burn a heretical text and 3 more copies would surface within a decade, each more virulent than the original. Execute everyone who had read forbidden xenos scripture, and their dying thoughts would seed nightmares across the sector. Certain truths, once released into the collective consciousness of humanity, could not be contained by conventional means. They spread like disease, mutating as they passed from mind to mind, growing stronger with each retelling until entire worlds fell into madness and rebellion. The only solution was isolation. Lock the dangerous knowledge away in vaults so deep and so well guarded that it might as well not exist, and pray to the Emperor that the seals never failed. But seals do fail. Corrigan told me this late one night, his voice dropping so low I had to lean close to hear him over the perpetual hum of the ventilation systems. Ceramite corrodes. Adamantium develops stress fractures. Psychic wards degrade when exposed to certain emanations from the warp. The archives were not static tombs, but active containment facilities that required constant maintenance and monitoring. Tech priests from the Adeptus Mechanicus made regular pilgrimages into the depths, performing rituals of inspection and renewal that combined engineering with prayer in ratios that shifted according to mysteries I was not cleared to understand. Sometimes they would emerge from the restricted sections walking normally, their mechadendrites coiling and uncoiling with mechanical precision. Sometimes they would stumble out trailing binary screams from their vox grills, their biological components convulsing while their augmetics fought to shut down higher brain functions before contamination could spread. I saw this myself once, watched as a tech priest collapsed in the corridor outside a sealed vault, his remaining eye weeping fluid that steamed when it hit the stone floor. The custodians moved with terrifying speed, scooping up the writhing form and disappearing back into the restricted zone before I could process what had happened. Corrigan pulled me away before I could ask questions. "Do not speak of it," he hissed. "Do not think about it. Do not wonder what he saw. That path leads only to the same fate." The nature of what lay in those deepest vaults was never explicitly stated, but fragments reached us through whispered conversations and overheard briefings. Xenos artifacts that could rewrite reality within their spheres of influence. Texts penned by the ancient Eldar that contained psychic triggers embedded in the very structure of their language, so that reading certain passages aloud would tear holes in the veil between materium and immaterium. Data slates recovered from the dark age of technology, containing construction schematics for weapons that had nearly ended humanity's existence during Old Night. Confessions extracted from captured Alpha Legion operatives detailing infiltration strategies so insidious that merely knowing they existed made you question the loyalty of everyone around you. Prophecies spoken by unsanctioned psychers in the moments before their execution, Predictions that had proven accurate with such consistent regularity that the Inquisition could not dismiss them as mere ravings, yet could not act upon them without validating the very heresies they sought to suppress. Corrigan's hands shook worse when he spoke of the prophecies. He had read some of them. He confessed to me one night when exhaustion had stripped away his usual caution. Not the originals, which were kept in vaults so restricted that their locations appeared on no maps and could be accessed only by direct order of the High Lords of Terra themselves, but copies, sanitized versions that had been deemed safe enough for archival cataloging. Even those redacted fragments had cost him his sleep. He described visions of the Golden Throne failing, of Terra drowning in warp storms that would make the Cicatrix Maledictum look like a summer squall, of the Emperor's corpse rising from its throne to lead an army of the damned against the very Imperium he had built. They seal these things away, not because they are lies, Corrigan said, his voice hollow, but because they might be true. Can you imagine what would happen if even a fraction of the Imperium's population learned that our God Emperor might be transforming into something we cannot comprehend? That the very thing we worship might become the instrument of our destruction? Chaos would reign within days. Entire sectors would tear themselves apart. The archives keep us sane by keeping us ignorant. I asked him once why he stayed, why any of us stayed in these depths, when transfer to surface duties was possible for scribes with sufficient seniority. He looked at me as though I had asked why stars burned or why the void was cold. Because someone must, he said simply. Because if we do not maintain these seals, if we do not catalog and monitor and pray over these contained horrors, then they will escape. And when they escape, when that knowledge floods back into the galaxy, there will be no salvation, no rescue, no hope of survival. We are not guards or soldiers. We are a levee holding back an ocean of madness, and the moment we abandon our posts, the flood begins. The incident occurred during my 3rd year in the depths. I had been assigned to assist with a routine inspection of Vault 97, a mid-level restricted section that supposedly contained xenological specimens from the Rangdan xenocides. The specimens were long dead, their biological components preserved in stasis fields, their threat level assessed as minimal provided containment protocols were observed. Corrigan was the senior archivist for the inspection, accompanied by 2 custodians and a tech priest, whose name I never learned because he communicated exclusively through binaric cont. We descended through passages I had never traveled before, moving past checkpoints where armed servitors tracked our progress with weapons I could not identify, down into sections where the walls wept condensation despite the dry cold that made my breath visible. Vault 97's entrance was a circular aperture 12 meters in diameter, its surface covered with interlocking seals of purity wax stamped with the personal sigils of inquisitors long dead. The tech priest began breaking the seals with precise movements, collecting the wax fragments in a ceramite container for later analysis. The custodians stood motionless, their guardian spears held at ready positions, their eyes scanning the shadows that pressed against the weak illumination of our portable lumens. Corrigan stood beside me, his hands shaking so badly he had to clasp them together to hide the tremor. "Standard procedure," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Verify stasis field integrity. Confirm catalog numbers match manifest. Reseal and depart. 30 minutes, no more." The tech priest finished breaking the final seal and input the access codes into a panel that appeared to be grown from the door itself rather than installed. Mechanisms within the walls groaned to life, sounds of ancient machinery stirring from hibernation, and the door began to open with that terrible breathing sound, that wet exhalation that turned my spine to ice. Light spilled from within the vault, not the harsh white of lumens, but something softer and wrong, a pale greenish glow that seemed to pulse with irregular rhythm. The smell hit me next. Biological decay mixed with something chemical and sharp, like disinfectant failing to mask rot. One of the custodians stepped forward, his armor sensors sweeping the interior before he signaled clear. Corrigan gripped my wrist in warning, but did not speak. We entered. The vault was larger than I had expected, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above us, its walls lined with containment vessels of various sizes. Each vessel glowed with that sickly green light, illumination coming from within the stasis fields themselves rather than any external source. I could see shapes suspended in those fields. Organic forms that hurt to look at directly, geometries that seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. The tech priest moved from vessel to vessel, his mechadendrites interfacing with monitoring systems, his binary chatter filling the silence with strings of code I could not parse. Corrigan consulted his data slate, checking catalog numbers, his stylus scratching notes with hands that shook harder with each passing moment. The custodians maintained their vigil at the entrance, but I noticed their postures had changed subtly. Their spears held slightly higher, their heads canting as though listening for sounds beyond human hearing. I was examining a smaller containment vessel near the back of the vault. When I noticed the crack, it was tiny, barely visible, running along the seam where the stasis field generator connected to the vessel's base. The field itself appeared intact, that green glow uninterrupted, but something about the crack drew my attention with magnetic intensity. I leaned closer, trying to determine if it warranted reporting, and that was when I saw the movement. Something inside the vessel, something that should have been frozen in temporal stasis, turned what might have been a head to face me. I cannot describe what I saw in that moment because my mind refuses to process the memory completely. There were too many angles, too many surfaces existing in spaces that should not have supported them. The thing that might have been an eye opened, and it was not looking at me with curiosity or hunger or any emotion I could name. It was looking at me with recognition. I stumbled backward, my boot catching on something, and I fell hard against another containment vessel. The impact was minor, barely enough to register, but I felt the vessel shift slightly on its mounting. For one eternal second, nothing happened. Then the alarms began. They did not blare or wail, but whispered, a sound like voices speaking in languages that predated human speech, growing louder not in volume, but in presence, as though reality itself was trying to communicate warnings through the only channels available. The tech priest's binaric chatter became a scream of code. The custodians moved instantly, their spears igniting with energy fields that cast harsh shadows across the vault. Corrigan grabbed my arm and hauled me to my feet, his face drained of color, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or profanity. The vessel I had bumped was failing. I could see it happening in real time, watch the stasis field flicker and pulse, its green glow darkening to something closer to black. The shape inside, whatever xenos horror had been frozen there since the Rangdan Xenocides, began to move with terrible slowness, its incomprehensible form testing the boundaries of its prison. The tech priest was at the vessel within seconds, his mechadendrites working frantically at the controls, attempting to reinforce the field before catastrophic failure. But something was wrong. The readings on his displays were scrolling too fast, cascading errors that multiplied faster than he could address them. One of the custodians spoke, his voice the first time I had heard one of them utter words, and what he said was worse than any alarm. The field is not failing. It is being opened from inside. What happened next lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but exists in my memory as an eternity carved into moments of crystalline horror. The stasis field collapsed completely, that green glow winking out like an extinguished candle, and the thing inside began to emerge. Not physically, not yet, but conceptually, as though its very existence was spilling out into reality like water from a broken dam. The air in the vault became thick, resistant to breathing, carrying a taste of metal and burning hair. Sounds began, not from the vessel but from all around us. Whispers in the walls and floor, voices speaking words that meant nothing yet conveyed meaning directly into my brain. I understood, in that moment of contact, that this creature had been aware during its entire containment, its consciousness never truly frozen, merely compressed into a space so small that it could only think one thought per century. And the thought it had been thinking, the single focus of its existence during millennia of imprisonment, was escape. The custodians acted without hesitation or fear. They moved as one, their spears coming down in coordinated strikes that carved through the failing containment vessel with precision that bordered on supernatural. One thrust his spear directly into the center of mass of the emerging entity, and I saw something that should not have been possible. The spear passed through the creature without resistance, as though striking shadow, and where it touched, reality itself seemed to recoil. The creature was not fully material, I realized. It existed in multiple states simultaneously, flickering between forms, its substance shifting from solid to ethereal, to something that had no name in human language. The second custodian activated something in his armor, and a field of golden light exploded outward, bathing the vault in illumination that seared my retinas, even through closed eyelids. I heard the creature scream, though it had no mouth and made no sound. A sensation of pure agony transmitted directly into my nervous system. The tech priest had abandoned his attempts at repair and was now working to reinforce the other containment vessels, his efforts focused on preventing a cascade failure that would release every specimen in the vault simultaneously. His remaining organic components were bleeding from multiple orifices, blood and other fluids streaming down his robes, but his mechanical portions continued functioning with tireless precision. Corrigan had pulled me toward the exit, his grip on my arm painful in its intensity. But I could not look away from the battle unfolding before us. The custodians were fighting something that refused to remain in one place, that existed everywhere and nowhere within the vault simultaneously. Their spears cut through its forms again and again, each strike accompanied by that golden light, each impact causing the creature to flicker and contract. But it would not die, could not die perhaps, because death implied a singular existence that could be ended. And this thing was never singular, never complete, always shifting between states of being that included alive and dead and other, conditions for which no words existed. Then one of the custodians spoke words I could not understand, syllables that carried weight beyond mere sound, and the golden light emanating from his armor intensified until the entire vault was drowning in radiance. The creature convulsed, its forms collapsing inward, compressing back toward the broken vessel it had emerged from. The second custodian joined the incantation, his voice harmonizing with his brother's in tones that resonated in my bones. The tech priest added his contribution, binary cant transforming into something that sounded almost melodic, a prayer in the language of machines directed at the machine god or the omnissiah, or perhaps the emperor himself. And slowly, with agonizing reluctance, the creature retreated. It did not surrender or submit, but was forced back through sheer application of will, made manifest through faith and fury, compressed once more into the space it had occupied, bound by powers I could not comprehend, wielded by warriors I could never emulate. The vault door slammed shut with that same wet-breathing sound, sealing us inside with the contained horror. And for one terrible moment when I thought we had been abandoned, locked in as contaminated sacrifices to prevent the spread of whatever we had witnessed. Then, auxiliary lighting activated, harsh white lumens that banished the green glow and revealed the full extent of the damage. The containment vessel I had bumped was shattered, its components scattered across the floor, but the creature was gone, vanished as though it had never existed. The other vessels appeared intact, their stasis fields pulsing with steady rhythm, their contents mercifully motionless. The tech priest collapsed, his systems finally reaching the limits of their tolerance, steam venting from overheated components. One of the custodians moved to him immediately, checking for signs of life with surprising gentleness. The other custodian turned to face us, and I saw that his golden armor was scorched black in places, the metal itself warped by forces that should not have been able to affect such consecrated material. Corrigan spoke first, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands that had spread to his entire body. "Status?" he asked, the single word carrying the weight of everything we needed to know. The standing custodian regarded him for a long moment before responding. "Contained," he said, though whether he meant the creature or us, I could not determine. "The breach was minor. The contamination is manageable. You will undergo psychic screening and memory adjustment before returning to active duty." Memory adjustment. The words sent ice through my veins. They were going to take this from me, erase the experience, leave me with gaps and scars where knowledge used to live. I wanted to protest. to argue that I deserved to remember what I had survived. But Corrigan's grip on my arm tightened in warning, and I swallowed my objections. The custodian continued speaking, his words measured and final. You have witnessed a Category 5 containment incident. Such events occur approximately once per Terran year within the restricted archives. The failure rate is considered acceptable given the nature of what we contain. The entity you encountered was a Rangdan neural parasite, one of the last surviving specimens from the Xenocide campaigns. It had been contained for 8,000 years. Its consciousness had degraded during imprisonment, fragmenting into subunits that could no longer cooperate effectively. This, ultimately, is what allowed us to force its recontainment. Had it been whole, had it retained the full capacity of its species, none of us would have survived. He paused, and I saw something flicker across his face that might have been the closest thing to emotion a custodian could display. You are fortunate. Most who trigger breaches do not live long enough to remember their mistake. They extracted us from the vault through procedures that involved rituals of cleansing I did not understand, and injections of chemical compounds that burned like liquid fire in my veins. The tech priest was carried out on a grav stretcher, his vital signs weak but stable, his mechanical components already beginning automated repair sequences. We were separated immediately upon exiting the restricted zone, each taken to different chambers for individual processing. I never saw Corrigan again after that day. I heard later, through whispered conversations between scribes who thought I could not overhear, that he had failed psychic screening. The contamination had taken root too deeply in his mind, planted seeds of knowledge that could not be extracted without destroying the host consciousness entirely. They gave him mercy, I was told, a quick death administered by the same custodians who had saved our lives. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered into one of Terra's industrial processing plants, his atoms recycled into the endless production that fed the Imperium's war machine. Even in death, he served. My own psychic screening lasted 3 days, though I have only fragmentary memories of the process. Sanctioned psychers probed my mind with surgical precision, excising memories like tumors, cauterizing the pathways that led to dangerous knowledge. I remember pain, bright and sharp as broken glass, and I remember voices speaking in languages I did not know, asking questions I could not answer because the answers had already been removed. When they finally released me, my mind felt hollow, echoing with absences I could not name. I knew something terrible had happened in Vault 97. I knew people had died or been compromised. But the details, the specifics that would let me understand what I had witnessed, were gone, erased, protected behind psychic barriers that would kill me if I tried to breach them. They assigned me to surface duties after that. Light cataloging work in the upper archives where the worst threat was paper cuts and eye strain from poor lighting. I should have been grateful. I should have counted myself blessed to escape the depths with my life and most of my sanity intact. But something had changed in me during those moments in the vault, some fundamental shift in perception that the psychers had either missed or deemed acceptable. I could feel the archives now, sense them beneath my feet like a living thing, breathing and shifting in the darkness. When I walked the corridors of the Imperial Palace's upper levels, surrounded by pilgrims and petitioners and bureaucrats who believed themselves safe, I could feel the weight of what lay below. The mass of contained horrors pressing upward like magma seeking release. I began having dreams, though I could not remember them upon waking. I would jolt awake in my quarters, heart racing, sheets soaked with sweat, carrying with me only the fading impression of green light and whispers in languages older than mankind. The dreams came more frequently as months passed, increasing in intensity until I was afraid to sleep, consuming stimulants to stay awake until exhaustion dragged me under, despite my resistance. The Medici servitors monitoring my health flagged the behavior as concerning, and I was summoned for psychological evaluation. I sat across from an evaluator whose augmetic eyes whirred and clicked as they scanned me, their biological lips moving in practiced expressions of concern that their mechanical gaze contradicted. I told them nothing. What could I say? That I felt the archives calling to me? That sometimes, In the silence between heartbeats, I could hear voices speaking from below, sharing secrets that disappeared from my mind even as I tried to grasp them. They would declare me compromised, contaminated, another failed vessel to be discarded before the infection spread. So I lied. I told them the stimulant use was merely poor judgment, a temporary lapse brought on by stress. I promised to adhere to prescribed sleep schedules and reduce my chemical intake. They believed me because they wanted to believe me, because processing a compromised scribe required paperwork and resources and attention that could be better spent elsewhere. They prescribed me mild sedatives and scheduled a follow-up evaluation in 6 months. I left their office with a smile and a container of pills I had no intention of taking, because I knew with absolute certainty that if I surrendered to chemically induced sleep, the dreams would take me completely, and I would not wake up unchanged. The years that followed were a study in functional madness. I performed my duties with mechanical efficiency, cataloging records and filing reports and maintaining the facade of normalcy that kept me employed and alive. But inside, in the spaces where my excised memories had left voids, something else was growing. I began to understand things I should not have known, comprehend patterns in the archive organization that existed only in theoretical models developed by savants with decades more experience. I could look at a data slate and know instantly which vault it belonged in, which level of restriction it required, which seals would be necessary to contain its contents. My supervisors praised my efficiency. My fellow scribes regarded me with suspicion and envy. No one asked how I'd become so proficient so quickly, because asking questions in the archives was the fastest path to discovering answers you did not want to possess. I learned, through careful observation and patient listening, that what had happened in Vault 97 was not unique. Containment breaches occurred with disturbing regularity throughout the restricted sections, minor failures caught and corrected before they cascaded into catastrophe. Tech priests died or went mad during routine maintenance at rates that would have been scandalous if anyone outside the archives knew about them. Custodians rotated through guard duties on schedules that seemed random until you realized they were calculated to prevent any single guardian from spending too much time near certain vaults, from developing the kind of familiarity that might lead to dangerous curiosity. The archives consumed people slowly, grinding them down through exposure to knowledge that human minds were not designed to hold, and the Imperium accepted this attrition as the necessary cost of maintaining its deepest secrets. I met others like me, scribes who had survived containment incidents and carried the scars of psychic adjustment. We never spoke directly about our experiences, bound by prohibitions that existed in our minds as physical walls we could not scale, but we recognized each other through subtle signs, the way our hands would shake when descending past certain depths, the involuntary flinches we displayed when passing vaults marked with specific warning sigils, the haunted quality in our eyes that no amount of rest could erase. We formed an unofficial network, supporting each other through the worst of the dreams and the moments of fragmentary memory that would surface unexpectedly, bringing with them sensory impressions of horrors we could not fully recall. We were the survivors, the compromised ones who had not failed badly enough to warrant termination, but had been changed irrevocably by what we had witnessed. One of them, a woman named Selene, who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite during a containment incident in the cryogenic vaults, told me something during a meal period when exhaustion had stripped away her usual caution. "They do not seal these archives to protect the knowledge," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They seal them to protect us. Every vault down there contains something that could shatter the Imperium if it escaped, not through military might or technological superiority, but through pure existential horror. There are truths in those vaults that would make every citizen of the Imperium question everything they believe about the Emperor, about humanity's place in the galaxy, about the very nature of reality itself. Can you imagine what would happen if even one of those truths reached the general population? The panic? The despair? The collapse of faith that binds a million worlds together? The archives are not libraries. They are prisons for ideas too dangerous to die. I asked her what kind of ideas could be that dangerous. and she smiled, but there was no humor in it. The kind that make you understand why the Emperor remained silent on the golden throne. The kind that explain what really happened to the lost Primarchs. The kind that detail exactly what humanity sacrificed during the dark age of technology, and what we might have become if we had not pulled back from the precipice. The kind that prove, beyond any doubt, that we are not alone in the galaxy and never were, and that the things sharing this universe with us regard humanity as we regard insects. Interesting, perhaps, but ultimately inconsequential and easily eliminated. She stopped speaking then, her remaining fingers trembling as they gripped her recaf mug. I should not have said any of that. Forget I spoke. Forget we had this conversation. For both our sakes. But I could not forget. Just as I could not forget the green light and the whispers and the sensation of something ancient and terrible looking at me with recognition. The knowledge that I did not fully possess haunted me more than any complete memory could have. I would lie awake during the prescribed rest periods, staring at the ceiling of my quarters, knowing that below me, kilometers of rock and metal and prayers away, things were contained that could unmake the reality I existed within. I would imagine the seals failing, not all at once in catastrophic apocalypse, but slowly, incrementally, allowing contamination to seep into the Imperium one mind at a time. How would we even know it was happening? How could we detect corruption that operated on timescales measured in centuries or millennia? I began researching, carefully and covertly, using my access privileges to examine records I had no legitimate reason to view. I learned about the Librarium Interdictus, theoretical vaults so restricted that their existence was classified above even inquisitorial clearance levels, accessible only to the High Lords of Terra and perhaps the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes. I learned about incidents where entire archive sections had been sealed and abandoned after contamination events that could not be contained. Kilometers of corridors and vaults transformed into quarantine zones where automated systems still functioned but no living being would ever enter again. I learned about the monitoring protocols, psychic surveillance networks that watched the archives constantly, searching for fluctuations that might indicate failing containment or emerging threats, staffed by sanctioned psychers who burned out and needed replacement at rates that staggered me. And I learned about the Watchers, though this knowledge came to me in fragments and implications rather than explicit statements. They were supposedly an organization within an organization, scribes and tech priests and even custodians who had served in the archives so long that they had developed an intuitive understanding of what lay contained below. They could sense disturbances in the vaults without psychic screening. They could predict containment failures hours or days before any monitoring equipment registered anomalies. They moved through the archives with authority that superseded official hierarchy, appearing at incident sites before summons went out, disappearing back into the depths before questions could be asked. I saw one once, I think, or perhaps I merely saw a scribe moving with unusual purpose through a corridor I had no business being in. They wore the same gray robes we all wore, carried the same data slates and catalog equipment, but something about their posture, the way they moved through the shadows, as though made of the same substance, marked them as different. I tried to follow at a distance, curious despite the warnings screaming in the back of my mind. But they rounded a corner, and when I reached the same intersection seconds later, the corridor beyond was empty. No doors, no alcoves, no possible exit. They had simply vanished, and I understood that I had glimpsed something I was not meant to see. The worst part of serving in the archives was not the danger, though the threat of contamination and death was ever present. It was not even the knowledge that I had lost parts of my memory, chunks of my personal history excised by psychic surgery. The worst part was the growing certainty that we were failing. The Imperium was 10,000 years old, and for 10,000 years it had been sealing away dangerous knowledge, adding vault upon vault to the archives beneath Terra. But containment was never permanent. Seals degraded. Fields failed. The warp pressed against reality with increasing intensity as the cicatrix maledictum tore the galaxy in half. Every year, more incidents occurred. Every year, More scribes and tech priests and custodians were lost to contamination or combat or simple psychological collapse. The archives were filling up, running out of space, and eventually there would be no more room for new horrors, no more capacity to contain the terrible knowledge that humanity continued to discover or create. I imagined sometimes what would happen if the archives failed completely, if every vault opened simultaneously and released its contents into Terra's atmosphere. Would the planet die instantly, consumed by warp entities and xenos plagues and psychic contagions? Would it transform into something else? A world where reality no longer applied consistent rules, where the past and future and present existed simultaneously? Or would it simply go silent? Every living being on its surface reduced to mindless vessels repeating truths too terrible for sanity to survive. I did not know. No one knew. But I suspected that contingencies existed. Protocols buried so deep in the Adeptus Custodes' operational doctrines that even thinking about them might trigger monitoring systems. If Terra fell, if the archives were breached beyond recovery, I believed the entire planet would be destroyed. Cyclonic torpedoes launched from orbit by the Imperial Navy, acting on orders sealed since the Horus Heresy. The cradle of mankind, reduced to debris and radioactive ash, sacrificed to prevent contamination from spreading beyond the Sol system. It would be the right choice, the only choice, but the knowledge that such protocols likely existed made me understand just how dangerous the archives truly were. I served for another 7 years after the Vault 97 incident, though the time became increasingly difficult to measure as my sense of chronology began to fragment. Days blended together into seamless passages of cataloging and filing and trying not to think about what lay in the vaults I tended. I developed habits that kept me functional, rituals of behavior that provided structure when my mind threatened to fracture under the weight of absent memories and present horrors. I ate at the same times each day. I walked the same routes through the archives. I spoke the same words to the same people in the same order. The repetition was comforting, a framework of normalcy imposed on an existence that was anything but normal. Then came the day when I was summoned to the administratum offices in the Upper Palace, an unusual enough occurrence that I felt immediate dread. Scribes in the deep archives rarely interacted with surface bureaucracy, our duties keeping us isolated from the administrative machinery that governed the wider Imperium. I ascended through levels I had not visited in years, emerging into sections where natural light still penetrated through armored windows, where the air smelled of incense and humanity rather than recycled atmosphere and fear. The official who met me was a minor functionary, her robes clean and expensive, her augmetics decorative rather than functional. She consulted a data slate with manicured fingers before speaking. "Your service term is complete," she said, her tone suggesting this was routine. "You are hereby released from archival duties with the administratum's gratitude for your dedication. Standard severance benefits apply. You may request assignment to other branches or return to civilian life as you prefer." I stared at her, uncomprehending. Released? After everything I had witnessed, everything that had been done to my mind, they were simply letting me go. The functionary noticed my confusion, and her expression softened slightly. "The archives consume people," she said, and I heard actual sympathy in her voice. "Your psychological evaluations show concerning degradation. Better to cycle you out now while you can still potentially reintegrate into society than wait until you require more intensive intervention. These are not judgments against your character or competence, merely acknowledgments of reality. No one serves in the deep archives forever. The human mind has limits." They gave me a travel voucher and a small stipend, and 72 hours to vacate my quarters. I spent the first day sitting in my cell, staring at the walls, unable to process the sudden absence of purpose that had defined my existence for a decade. I had expected to die in the archives, had made peace with that probability, and now I was being ejected back into a world I barely remembered and was certainly no longer equipped to navigate. Where would I go? What would I do? How could I explain the gaps in my memory, or the way my hands still shook when I descended stairs, or the dreams that would never stop coming? On the second day, I gathered my few possessions and began the long ascent toward the surface. The journey took hours, passing through security checkpoints where guards verified my authorization to leave, through decontamination chambers where machines scanned me for biological and psychic contamination. I passed other scribes heading down to begin their shifts, young men and women with clear eyes and straight backs, who had not yet learned what waited for them in the depths. I wanted to warn them. I wanted to grab them and scream that they should run, should abandon their posts and flee Terra entirely before the archives consumed them. But I said nothing. What good would warnings do? They would serve just as I had served, sacrifice their sanity and memories to maintain the seals that kept humanity safe from knowledge it could not survive. And some of them would break, and some of them would die, and a few would emerge years later, as I was emerging now, hollowed out and haunted, but alive. I reached the surface during what passed for evening on Terra, the smog-choked sky glowing with the reflected light of hab blocks and manufactorums that never slept. The air tasted of chemicals and smoke, harsh against lungs accustomed to the filtered atmosphere of the deep archives. The noise was overwhelming, millions of voices and vehicles and machines creating a din that pressed against my ears. People moved past me in rivers of humanity, pilgrims and workers and merchants and soldiers, none of them aware that beneath their feet, buried in rock and darkness, lay vaults containing horrors that could end their civilization. Their ignorance was beautiful. I envied them desperately. I found lodging in a hab block near the Palace District, a small room that cost most of my stipend, but offered relative safety and a door that locked. I spent my days trying to build a routine, attempting to find work that would occupy my mind without requiring me to explain my employment history or the gaps in my memory. But the archives had marked me in ways that made integration impossible. I would flinch at sounds that reminded me of containment alarms. I would avoid certain colors of light. I would wake screaming from dreams I could not remember, disturbing neighbors who complained to the building's administrator. I began to understand that I would never truly leave the archives, that they had hollowed me out and filled the space with something that could not exist comfortably in normal society. I lasted 3 months on the surface before I went back. Not back to the deep archives, they would not have accepted me, but back to the palace, to the administrative offices, to beg for any position that would allow me to serve again. The same functionary who had processed my release regarded me with sad recognition. "This happens sometimes," she said quietly. "The archives call you back. We can offer you surface-level work, cataloging duties in the public access sections. It is not glamorous, but it is safe, and it would let you stay near what you know." I accepted immediately, grateful beyond words for the opportunity to return to the only environment where I still made sense. So here I remain, years later, working in the upper archives where tourists and scholars come to study sanitized histories and approved records. I catalog their requests and retrieve the materials they seek and return them to their proper places when borrowing periods expire. It is simple work, mindless work, and it keeps me stable in ways that life outside the palace never could. But every day, multiple times per day, I feel it. The weight of the deep archives below me, pressing upward like a physical force. I sense the containment field straining against what they hold. I hear whispers that exist only in my mind, fragments of knowledge my conscious thoughts cannot access, but my deeper awareness will never forget. I know what lies below, not the specifics, those were taken from me, but the essential truth that cannot be erased. Some knowledge is too dangerous to exist freely in the world, and the Imperium maintains its grip on sanity only through constant vigilance against the truths that would destroy it. The archives terrify even the masters of the Imperium because they represent the sum total of everything humanity has discovered that humanity cannot survive knowing. Every vault is a door we must never open. Every seal is a prayer that must never fail. And every person who serves in those depths, who tends those containments, who guards those secrets, sacrifices pieces of themselves to keep the rest of humanity safe from enlightenment that would annihilate them. Some nights, when the dreams are particularly vivid, I remember standing in Vault 97 watching something ancient and terrible look at me with recognition. I remember understanding, in that moment before the psychic surgery took the memory away, that the creature was not surprised to see me. It had been waiting, not for me, specifically, but for any human, any consciousness it could touch, any mind it could whisper to across the barrier of its containment. And it had succeeded. Something of that encounter remained in me, buried beneath psychic barriers and suppressed memories, but alive and aware and patient. I am contaminated. I have always been contaminated. The psychic screening missed something or decided I was not dangerous enough to terminate. And now I walk the surface levels of Terra carrying within me a fragment of knowledge that should have been sealed away forever. This is what terrifies the Imperium. Not that the archives might fail catastrophically, though that possibility haunts every contingency plan and emergency protocol. What truly terrifies them is the slow contamination, the gradual seepage of dangerous knowledge into the population through survivors like me, through fragments and whispers and dreams that carry meaning beyond their apparent content. Every person who enters the restricted vaults comes out changed, and not all of those changes can be detected or corrected by psychic screening. We are vectors for mimetic contagions that spread through conversation and proximity, infecting others with questions they should never ask and curiosities they should never indulge. The archives do not need to fail to kill the Imperium. They merely need to touch enough minds, corrupt enough souls, plant enough seeds of forbidden knowledge that eventually, inevitably, critical mass is reached, and the entire structure of faith and ignorance that keeps humanity functional collapses under the weight of truth. I think about this as I catalog another request from a scholar researching pre-Unity Terra. I retrieve the approved texts and deliver them with a smile that has become automatic. The scholar thanks me and settles in to read, unaware that the person serving them spent a decade in vaults. This scholar does not have clearance to know exist, unaware that I carry fragments of knowledge that could reshape their entire understanding of reality, unaware that I am, myself, a walking containment failure, a breach that was deemed acceptable, a calculated risk in the Imperium's endless war against the dangerous truths that define existence in this galaxy. The archives will never release me, not truly. I will serve them in one capacity or another until the day I die. And when I die, my body will be cremated, and my ashes will be scattered just as Corrigan's were, my atoms recycled into the industrial machine that sustains Terra. And perhaps, somewhere in the deep archives, in a vault so restricted it appears on no maps, there is a record of my service, a data slate containing the full account of what happened in Vault 97, preserved for reasons I cannot fathom by authorities I will never meet. Perhaps centuries from now, another scribe will catalog that record, will read about the neural parasite and the containment breach, and the survivors who were adjusted and released. Perhaps they will wonder, as I wondered, what it means to serve in the depths. Perhaps they will learn, as I learned, that some doors should never be opened, but always are because humanity cannot resist the lure of forbidden knowledge, even when that knowledge comes with a guarantee of damnation. The Emperor protects, we say. We repeat it like a mantra, a prayer, a shield against the darkness. But down in the archives, in the vaults where the most terrible secrets are sealed, there are no prayers, only protocols, only procedures, only the cold calculus of containment and acceptable loss. The Emperor protects, but the archives persist, and what they contain will outlast faith and hope and perhaps humanity itself. This is what I know. This is what I cannot speak but cannot forget. This is the truth that lives in the hollows where my memories used to be. The Imperium's deepest fear is not external threats or heretical corruption or xenos invasion, but the knowledge it has locked away within itself, the truths it discovered and could not destroy, the horrors it must preserve, because eliminating them would require acknowledging their existence, and that acknowledgement alone would be catastrophic. I am a survivor of the deep archives. I am a vector of contamination. I am proof that containment always fails, but slowly enough that the failure goes unnoticed until it is too late to matter. And somewhere below me, in darkness that lumens cannot penetrate and faith cannot illuminate, the seals are straining, The vaults are breathing, and the terrible knowledge waits with infinite patience for the day when the doors open and humanity finally learns what it has been protecting itself from for 10,000 years. That day may be centuries away, or it may be tomorrow. The archives keep their secrets, even from those who serve them, especially from those who serve them, because the alternative to ignorance is not wisdom, but annihilation. The scholar finishes reading and returns the texts to my desk. I log them back into the catalog system and return them to their shelves. Another day passes in the upper archives where nothing terrible happens and no one goes mad, and the Imperium continues its slow march toward whatever fate awaits it. And I continue serving, hollowed out and haunted but alive, a walking reminder that some knowledge is too dangerous to exist, some truths too terrible to speak, and some archives terrify even the masters of the Imperium because they represent everything humanity has learned that humanity must never remember. The vault door does not scream when it closes. It sighs, a sound of relief or resignation, impossible to distinguish between them. And in that exhalation, in that moment when the seals engage and the locks rotate into position and the psychic wards activate to reinforce the physical barriers, you understand that you are not being protected from what lies within. You are being protected from yourself, from your own curiosity, from the inevitability that if the door remains accessible, you will eventually open it, because humanity has never encountered a forbidden thing it could resist forever. The archives know this. The custodians know this. The Emperor himself, silent on his golden throne, surely knows this. We are all complicit in our own eventual destruction, cataloging and preserving and maintaining the very things that will ultimately consume us. Because the alternative is admitting that some knowledge should never have been discovered. And to admit that would be to acknowledge that humanity's quest for understanding, for enlightenment, for mastery over the material universe, was itself a catastrophic mistake from which we can never recover. I leave the archives at the end of my shift and ascend through the palace toward my hab block. The journey takes me past windows where I can see Terra's polluted sky, past prayer halls where pilgrims kneel before images of the Emperor, past barracks where soldiers prepare for deployments to wars they will likely not survive. All of them are ignorant. All of them are blessed. And I envy them more than I can express, because they live in a version of reality where faith matters and hope exists, and the future might be better than the past. I know better. I have seen what lies below, felt it looking back at me with recognition, understood that the only thing separating civilization from cosmic horror is a collection of locks and seals and prayers that grow weaker with each passing century. But I cannot tell them this, cannot warn them, cannot share the burden of knowledge that has hollowed me out and left me broken in ways psychic surgery could not fix. So I smile. I nod to the guards at checkpoints. I navigate crowds of oblivious humanity moving through their lives without awareness of what supports their existence. And I return to my small room where the dreams wait, patient and inevitable, ready to show me fragments of truths I cannot remember, but can never forget. The archives have marked me. They have claimed me, and whether I serve in their depths or on their surface or flee to the far edges of the Imperium, I will always be theirs, another contaminated vessel carrying forward the slow infection of forbidden knowledge that will, eventually, spread far enough to matter. This is my testimony. This is my confession. This is the only record that will exist of what I witnessed in Vault 97 before the psychic surgeons took it from me. Written in moments between shifts when the dreams are fresh and the memories surface briefly before sinking back into the depths where they were buried. I will hide this account where it will never be found, or perhaps where it will be found centuries from now, by someone who needs to understand what service in the archives truly costs. And then I will return to my duties, cataloging sanitized histories and approved records, maintaining the facade of normalcy that keeps the Imperium functional, pretending that I do not hear the whispers from below or feel the seals straining or know with absolute certainty that someday, somehow, the archives will fail and everything they contain will flood back into a galaxy that has grown fat and complacent on manufactured ignorance. The Emperor protects. We say it because we must. Because the alternative is admitting that the Emperor, mighty as he is, cannot protect us from ourselves, cannot shield us from the consequences of 10,000 years of accumulated terrible knowledge, cannot prevent the inevitable moment when curiosity overcomes caution and someone, somewhere, opens a vault that should have remained sealed forever. And when that day comes, when the contamination spreads beyond the ability of any containment protocol to manage, we will finally understand why the archives terrified even the masters of the Imperium, not because of what they contained, but because of what that containment represented. The acknowledgement that humanity had discovered things it could not safely know, created things it could not safely possess, learned things it could not safely remember, and the only solution was to lock them away and pray that the locks never failed. But locks always fail, seals always degrade, and prayers, no matter how fervent, cannot alter the fundamental nature of reality. The archives are waiting, the contents are patient, and somewhere in the darkness beneath Terra, in vaults that breath when they should be silent and watch when they should be empty, the terrible knowledge dreams of freedom and the day when humanity finally learns what it has been hiding from itself for 10 millennia. That day is coming. The only question is whether anyone will survive long enough to regret it.